2 days after the United States shot down a suspected Chinese spy balloon, Beijing has accused Washington of damaging efforts to stabilize U.S.-China ties. Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng also accused the U.S. of, quote, indiscriminate use of force. So today on the program, we are looking to answer two questions arising out of all this. Firstly, what next for bilateral ties between the two powers? And second, how is China reacting to increased US and Western engagement in Asia, an area Beijing considers its own backyard? We'll get to those questions in a minute, but before that, this is what the reaction in China has been to the shooting down of the balloon.
I think this is a bit of an embarrassing moment for the Americans, because the US Air Force, which prides itself on being the world's leading air force, surprisingly did not solve this civilian aircraft problem quickly. They dragged it out for 3 days. From my perspective, when I think about it, if it were a US balloon which had floated to China, we may take similar measures. From a personal point of view, it's probably not a big deal. It's understandable. Considering that the current international situation is very tense, I think I can understand the reaction from the United States. They're making a big fuss about this incident. It doesn't do any good. It doesn't serve world peace.
And joining us now for more is Blake Herzinger. He's a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and specializes in U.S. security cooperation in Asia. Blake, welcome. Secretary Blinken called it a surveillance balloon and termed it, quote, a clear violation of sovereignty. What has Beijing been able to achieve with this episode?
Well, thanks for having me, Baresh. Well, the Department of State and the Department of Defense seem unified in their assessment that this balloon was intended for surveillance over the United States. Now, in terms of Beijing's achievements, they've managed to get a high-level meeting between Secretary Blinken and his counterpart from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs canceled. Tensions, which were already high, are now further inflamed, and it seems that there's not much positive to take home for Beijing from this episode.
But has this episode further worsened divisions in America's polity as well? I ask because you hear Republicans unhappy it took a Democratic president so long to shoot down a balloon.
Well, so I think that's probably also the root of some of the disclosures in the last day or so about other balloons that have traversed parts of the United States, come near the Hawaiian Islands and Guam, and also in past years, we've seen similar Chinese balloons over Japan and Okinawa and Taiwan.
So what next in the bilateral relationship, given that this is the situation when it comes to at least surveillance balloons?
Well, Secretary Blinken certainly left the door open for a future meeting. He said, now is not the right time, but we'll postpone, not cancel, until the time is more conducive for a meeting that we can have that won't be dominated by news of this balloon and this intrusion into American airspace.
But back in November, Blake, when Presidents Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, there appeared to be some sort of hope that the two powers could, quote, manage their differences. Now that Secretary Blinken has postponed his visit, has that hope from Bali disappeared, or is it just on hold?
I would consider it on hold. I think both sides recognize at some level that current tensions are unsustainable. Beijing is certainly eager to reduce tensions on its periphery and externally as it deals with multiple crises at home. And the United States doesn't really have an interest in inflaming relations with China just for the sake of inflaming relations. Now, it is difficult domestically to manage that message. There are certainly parties that are a harder line on China than maybe the president or others might like to see, but that's part of managing that relationship. And I'm sure this meeting will go forward at the right time, but it certainly isn't right now.
Blake, I'd like to go on to another point that I'd like to discuss with you, because in the week leading up to Secretary Blinken's visit, you had U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin as well, who was in the region in South Korea and the Philippines, and China clearly wasn't too happy about it.
US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin spent last week touring Asia-Pacific allies. An honour guard welcomed him in Seoul, where he arrived to bolster the US alliance in the face of rising missile and nuclear threats from North Korea.
Commitment to the defense of Korea is ironclad. You've heard us say that a number of times, but that's just not a slogan. It is what we're all about.
The very next day, American and Korean pilots staged joint air drills. Pyongyang said an extreme red line had been crossed. By then, Austin was in Manila visiting Washington's oldest Asian ally, announcing a deal which grants US access to yet more air bases in the Philippines, part of an effort to push back against Chinese aggression.
We remain committed to strengthening our mutual capacities to resist armed attack. That's just part of our efforts to modernize our alliance. And these efforts are especially important as the People's Republic of China continues to advance its illegitimate claims in the West Philippine Sea.
His counterpart underlined the stakes.
These efforts, which we hope to jointly undertake, is in line with the guidance of President Ferdinand Marcos, and that is for the Defense Department to make sure that not an inch of our nation's territory will be lost.
But China lashed out at the US, condemning a Cold War mentality.
This is an act that escalates tensions in the region and endangers peace and stability. Countries should remain vigilant and avoid being used by the US.
This is a site that will do little to settle Beijing's nerves. Jens Stoltenberg, chief of the North Atlantic Military Pact, NATO, meeting with South Korean and Japanese leaders recently. His visit to an airbase, part of a bid to strengthen ties with Asian democracies, as fears of a potential conflict between China and Taiwan grow stronger.
Blake, seen from Beijing's point of view, Lloyd Austin and Jens Stoltenberg's visits to the region aren't exactly confidence-building measures that China was perhaps looking for, right?
You'd be right in saying that might not be the message that Beijing wants to hear, but I think it's entirely fair for Secretary Austin to visit U.S. treaty allies and to reinforce those relationships, particularly when South Korea has been subjected to considerable nuclear threats and threats of preemption from the north. And the Philippines is constantly subject to, intimidation at sea from Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels. So it's entirely logical for the United States to support its closest partners in the region. And that may not be something that is popular in Beijing, but that is an element of the United States foreign policy that won't change.
But could this have been avoided given that this was in the week preceding a potential visit by Secretary Blinken to China?
I wouldn't necessarily consider these things as linked. First of all, Secretary Austin's visit to Korea is a very strong message against the North Koreans, certainly not aimed toward Beijing. And the Philippines, that's furthering an effort that's been going on there in terms of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, that's been going on for a decade. And our alliance with the Philippines goes back, far, far longer than that. Now, even if this was a hard message to swallow in Beijing, that does not warrant a violation of sovereign airspace in the United States in response.
I'd like to talk about NATO more specifically because Jens Stoltenberg was in the region. His visit to Japan and South Korea, is NATO going to be playing a more active part in the region now?
I wouldn't say so, Biresh. In my own opinion, I would say that NATO's interest in Asia is always in the interest of countering shared threats that transcend geography. For instance, transnational crime, certainly the threats of nuclear use from North Korea. These are of interest to all states that are interested in upholding a rules-based order. So in that sense, I would say it's furthering cooperation that does extend back to the 1980s and 1990s, both with Seoul and with Tokyo. Now, in terms of NATO's recent designation of China as a systemic challenge, now, that's something different. That is something where NATO is seeking to reinforce some of its security partners against what they see as a regional threat. But also China is operating in Europe increasingly. So NATO cannot afford to completely disassociate itself from what Beijing is doing militarily, economically, and diplomatically.
Let's talk about the countries in the region, Blake. Aside from the U.S. treaty allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, there are a number of other countries, particularly amongst ASEAN, who refuse to be drawn into picking a side when it comes to competition with China. How do they react to this increased activity in the region?
Absolutely. So speaking of states across Southeast Asia in particular, all those states are very interested in avoiding being drawn into this bilateral tension between Washington and Beijing. They both balance, they both hedge, they hew close to one partner when it is in their interest, and the other, other times. They need to balance these two interests without getting too close to either or being smashed in the middle. Certainly, Southeast Asia has very recent memory of great power competition playing out in its backyard, and there's no appetite to be drawn into a second round of that. But I think that's going to be the nature of this region, is that they will derive maximum benefit from each side to the extent they can, while also resisting being drawn into a competing bloc.
Blake, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. Blake Hesinger from the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And China has now confirmed that, like the one in the US, another high-altitude balloon spotted flying over Latin America is, in fact, Chinese. Beijing says it was used for flight tests and that it had been, quote, affected by weather forces, something that caused it to accidentally stray over Latin America and the Caribbean. The Pentagon has claimed this too is a surveillance balloon.